Welcome to lesson 2 of the T5 training video series, and today we'll be talking about the second part of deploying Yellowfin. So things that we are concentrating on would be clustering, backup and disaster recovery, and upgrades. So hopefully you've gone through the first lesson where we talk about performance and capacity planning, because you do need to know some of the things that we're talking about here in the lesson 2. And hopefully you have gone through that in lesson 1. So starting off with clustering, talking about performance, which we started in lesson 1, there will eventually come a point where a single machine just won't cut it in terms of performance, especially when the concurrent user size starts going into tens of thousands and 100,000s and all that, and you really want to cluster Yellowfin into multiple nodes, into multiple machines, and actually have some sort of load balancer running in front of it. Now, when you're starting to reach the limits for that of a single server, then you can essentially do that with Yellowfin clustering. So the application is actually ready for that if you want to turn that on. Note that just as a few initial points, that each node essentially shares a single Yellowfin repository database. So, for example, if you might run Yellowfin in a cluster, you might have 4 different nodes. It is still communicating with a single Yellowfin repository database. So you're not having 4 different repository databases in this model. Yellowfin in a clustered setup is also cluster aware. So it means it will actually notify other nodes of items that need to be flushed from caches. It will also send across synchronization messages. So if you delete something or you add something, all the other nodes will also know immediately. The background tasks that we talked about from lesson 1 can also be delegated to a particular chosen node. So for example, if you have additional CPU RAM on node 3, let's just say, and you want to have your secondary pools, which are running your background tasks, to be allocated to that node, you can do so as well in this clustered setup. So how do we actually install a Yellowfin cluster? Now, once we start this process up, the first node can essentially be installed the same way as a standalone instance of Yellowfin. So it means you're running the Yellowfin installer, you are choosing a particular repository database, you're choosing where to install Yellowfin into in a file system, and then away you go. It's exactly the same workflow. The only workflow where it becomes slightly different is when you're installing the rest of the nodes. So essentially, the additional nodes do not require a Yellowfin repository because you are referring to the one you've installed from the first time. So in order to support this, there are 2 options for this scenario. You either follow the file system replication model or you follow the reinstallation model. So the file system replication model is essentially copying the file folder, so the installation folder for the first node, across all the other multiple nodes, and then simply changing the .xml file to point to the original repository database. You could potentially also rerun the installer on the other nodes, and except in this time, rather than reinstalling a repository database into a real database, you can simply choose the embedded HSQL option, okay, which essentially installs the repository into a single file on your server. So that's just a temporary step that you can follow, and then once the Yellowfin is finished installing on the other nodes, you can then again come back to the .xml file and then redirect the repository to point to the first node's repository database. So in either of these 2 steps, you only ever need to change, as a last step, the web.xml file to make sure that you're referring to the right repository database. Okay? So that's basically how you do it. Now, there is also an additional thing that you need to add to each node in the web.xml file to ensure that the nodes are actually cluster aware, so that the entire cluster is aware that we have 4 nodes and let's communicate with each other. So you would actually add a cluster management servlet into the Yellowfin web.xml file, and again, the servlet syntax actually depends on the application messaging mode. Okay, so we'll talk about the 2 different nodes here. The modes here that would essentially affect your syntax and what you copy into the XML file. So when I refer to the messaging modes, Yellowfin essentially supports 2 different application messaging modes. One being whatever we've done so far. So these are the legacy mode that we're talking about, which is again driven by Axis web services. Okay, so it's a fairly old one, an oldie but a goodie. But some of the things that requires web service cluster messaging, and one of the things that actually power this is it actually requires all nodes to be defined as startup. So if you have 4 clustered nodes, in this particular model, it needs to know the 4 host names or the IP addresses of these nodes. So it needs to be decided beforehand. And it also doesn't quite allow the cluster instances to reside in the same host. So it has to be different. The newer version, which we call in dynamic mode, is basically multicast cluster messaging. So this is something that we rolled out pretty new, which uses JAX web services and supports inter-node messaging done by what we call a JGroups library, which is multicast. It will automatically find all the other nodes, so you don't actually need to prepare host names or actually list them out straight away. Okay. So just to explain a bit more, this JGroups multicast library is actually highly configurable. All right, so we actually find the other nodes and also support multiple cluster instances run on the same server as well. So it's pretty good. And what it actually does is it actually uses UDP multicast messages to actually determine the group membership and find new nodes, which again is super useful. And one of the things that it also allows is multiple input parameters. So for example, we could actually pass an XML file, which is a config file, to configure the JGroups library to maybe even use other methods for node discovery as well. And again, this is referenced in a broadcast configuration servlet parameter within the cluster management servlet. So we'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. So in the legacy mode, if you're choosing the Axis Web Services, then your cluster management servlet will look like this. So I know it looks pretty big, but it's actually pretty simple, and I'll walk you through that. So the first one is basically telling what servlet it is. So it's a cluster management one, that's the code base that we're referring to. Then you are basically followed by a few different parameters that you need to set. Okay, so first being the server's user and the server's password. This is usually reserved for your admin account in Yellowfin. You can certainly nominate some other account if you wish and put that here. The location is usually the same, which is /services administration servers, and the service port is basically corresponding to the port that you're running Yellowfin off on. So if you're running on 8081, then you need to put 8081 here. The cluster hosts are basically the hosts that are contained within your cluster, so you need to define them here and limit them with commas if you want. So if there's more than one node, just comma that and then add the rest of the nodes here. And the rest are pretty self-explanatory, like encryption. Do you want to do that? False and true, and most of them are all true by default. If you're using the second one, which is a dynamic mode, so JAX clustering, then the server looks slightly different. Quite similar, I would say, but except that in this case, that you would actually specify a cluster type to be dynamic, as you can see. There are also some additional parameters that you can set, like auto task delegation, which is automatically set to true. What that means is when you start up 4 nodes and you use this dynamic mode, it would technically automatically select a particular node to become the background task node. So automatically choose one of each and go, I'm going to make maybe node 2 as the one that runs all the background tasks. Note that you can actually turn this off and still override this and go, no, I want node 1 to be the one that's running all of my background tasks. Okay? So that's basically how you would actually enable clustering in Yellowfin. Now that's basically application clustering. Yellowfin also supports database clustering as well, even though that's actually external to the application. So for example, there might be cases where your concurrency is so high and there's so many requests to the repository database, eventually the repository database needs to be clustered itself as well. In this particular scenario, it is assumed that the database clustering is done by yourself as the client, as technically every database type clusters differently at the database level. Okay, and again, this should be transparent to Yellowfin because from Yellowfin's architecture, when we look at the repository database, we're expecting and we'll see it as a single database URL, and we're not too worried about how it's actually distributed across multiple nodes. So you could actually have an entire database cluster, but once you go to the top layer, it is still technically one URL, and then Yellowfin will use that to communicate with the entire cluster. Okay, so it is actually external to Yellowfin. Now, if you're asking what's the difference in terms of licensing if I'm using clustering, then you would actually need to use a cluster license to support this particular model. The cluster license is essentially the same as the name user license, except that the hosts are defined multiple times. So coming back to the 4-node example, you would actually have in the license the host name, all of the host names of the nodes. And the host name will be divided by a little pipe, so a single slash, and will be referenced in the license itself.